What is up everyone, welcome to my next video. In this tutorial, we'll be building an animated card using the React framework. Before we start programming, let's have a look at what we're going to build. As we can see here, we have 3 modern card elements, and when we hover on top of each one, we have a scaling effect. When we click on one, we'll have an expanded view, and we'll see that each item is loaded in one after the other in a fluid animation. I've also made the card responsive on different screen sizes, as we can see here. We'll also be using the Framer Motion library, which will help us build these complex animations with a simple syntax. So let's get into it. The source code will be available on GitHub. You can check the link in the description. Let's first start off by entering the command npx create react app. Then you can give it any title you want. When that's done, let's navigate into the directory we created and open VS Code. Let's continue by installing some of the libraries that we'll be using. Open up terminal and enter the command npm install Framer Motion. We'll be using this for the animations. When that's complete, you can enter the command npm install react icons. We'll be using this for some icons that we had in the cards. The next thing we'll do is import some Google fonts. The one I'll be using is called Quicksand. So if you head over to this page, on the right side, you'll notice that there's links we can copy paste. So copy paste this, then open VS Code, and in the public folder, you'll notice the index.html. We can copy paste these in over here. Next up, on this page, you'll notice there's CSS rules we'll need to apply. Copy paste this as well. Then head over in the source folder to the app.css file. I'll remove everything that we don't need in this file first. And then in the app class, we can apply the CSS font family. The next thing I'll add is just a padding that will be applied to all the styling inside this app class. Padding 25 pixels. So anything inside this class name will also have the padding of 25 pixels. Now let's do some cleanup in the app.js. There's a lot of stuff we don't need here, so we can just remove this. And remove this import as well. Now we can enter the command npm start. And when this completes, we should just see a blank page. As expected, we just have a blank page set up. Now let's add a folder. We'll call this constants. And inside here, we'll have a file called data.js. We'll use this to hold some static information like the property listings we had, with things like the image URL, the address, the price, just data that we can use for the cards. We can actually copy paste this from the repository I have. Again, the link will be in the description for this. So go ahead and copy paste this and put it in the data.js file. Now we're ready to start building the UI components. So let's make a folder called components. The first one we'll start with is the listing. So add a new file called listing.js. Inside here, we'll just have a React functional component. The only prop we'll pass in is data. And later on, we'll pass in the static data that we had in this constants folder, with things like the price, address, description, and things like that. Next, let's add some styling to this listing. Add a file called listing.css. I'll start by making a listing class, and in here we'll apply some styles like width, 25%, min width of, let's say, 300 pixels, a max width of 400 pixels, and then we can apply some other styling like position. I'll give this relative, Next, I'll have a margin of 20 pixels, a cursor of pointer, and I'll also apply a box shadow. I've already copy pasted one that I think looks nice. You can also grab this directly from my repository that I've listed in the description. And a background color of light gray. Next up, I'll add a pseudo element, so listing before. Now, what I'm about to do might seem a bit tricky and unintuitive, but I'll start with it and then I'll explain it later. So for content, we'll just have an empty string. For display, I'll put block. And lastly, I'll have a padding bottom. And then we'll apply a calculation of 5/4 times 100%. So what exactly is this doing? Well, this part right here is helping us to maintain an aspect ratio of this card. There's actually a really good article about this by CSS Tricks, and I'll have the link in the description for this. But the idea is that padding in percentages is based on the parent's width. So it's a nice trick that we can use to make a card that has an aspect ratio. Now that we've created the styles for this listing, let's make sure to actually apply the class. So go to listing.js, and inside this div, let's apply the class name equal to listing. Also, don't forget to import the CSS file. Now what I'll do is create a card component. And this will just be a React functional component. The only prop I'll pass in is data. For now, I'll render an empty fragment with a listing that we just created. And we can forward the data prop to this component. Now this might seem a bit useless, like why are we just wrapping this listing component inside a card? Well, the reason is because later on we'll have some logic for rendering the expanded view. So I'll leave this as a comment for now, and then we'll get back to this. I'll also make an index.js file that'll help us with importing this card. So I'll just title this index.js. We'll import the card. And then just export it. So we'll see later that it's a little trick to help us import the card from this folder. Now let's actually use this card component. Inside the app.js file, import the card. We can just import from /component/card because of the index.js file that we created earlier. Let's also import the properties from the static data file that we created. Now in this app div, let's make another one for the properties. So we can give this a class name of properties. We'll apply the styling later. And then inside here, we'll map through each property we have and render a card for that. So what we can do is type properties.map. And this will take an item as an argument, and it'll render a card. And here for the prop, we'll pass in that item. So if we check the output here, we'll notice that there's 3 listing components as we expected. I'll apply some styling to the properties class that we had created earlier. I'll give it a display of flex, a flex direction of row, flex wrap of wrap, and justify content center. So if we examine this now, we'll see that now these are positioned horizontally instead of vertically like before. The next thing we'll want to do is navigate to our index.css file and clean up some of the styles that we're not really using. So I'll get rid of this and this as well. In the body, we'll apply some basic styles like a margin of 0, padding of 0, and a default background color. You can copy paste this from the repository. And lastly, I'll apply a box sizing to every element. So I'll apply box sizing of border box. The only difference when using a box sizing of border box is the fact that when we're specifying the width and height, it'll automatically include any border or padding that you added. So this makes it easier to size elements. Another thing I'd like to point attention to is the fact that when we resize the window, we'll notice that the listings are responsive and they maintain the aspect ratio because of the CSS we applied earlier. So this is great for responsiveness. Next up, let's add some items to this listing component. So things like the image, the price, address, and things like that. Let's first destructure this data prop. So we'll take the image URL, the price, the address, number of bedrooms, number of washrooms, and living space. So here we're making use of the destructuring property of JavaScript. Next up, inside this div, I'll make another one, and I'll give it a class name of listing content. And this will just be used as a wrapper for all the content we'll have. Now we can first start with the image. So I'll make a div and give this a class name of a listing image container. And then finally the image itself. For the source, we'll pass in the image URL that we destructured above. And let's not forget to give this a class name as well. We can just call this listing image. And then just to remove this warning, we can pass in an alt, like real estate mansion. Let's continue with some styles. Firstly, let's style the listing content wrapper. So I'll just make this take the entire width and height of the listing card. To do that, I'll give it a position of absolute and left of 0, top of 0, and finally a width of 100% and height of 100%. We can also change things like the background color and just set it to white, the border radius, we can put this as 10 pixels, and overflow of hidden. Next up, let's style the listing image container. So we'll set the width to be 100%, but the height, we only want it to occupy a certain amount, so let's say 65% of the card. And lastly, we'll set the overflow to hidden. For the image itself, we'll make it take the entire width of the parent, the image container, so width and height of 100%. But we'll give this an object fit of cover. And what this will do is make sure that the image is not distorted, that it maintains its aspect ratio. So if we examine the output, we can see it's starting to come along. We have 3 listing components with an image that occupies a certain amount of height in that listing. and the aspect ratio is maintained for each one. I'll just apply a quick styling change. So for the listing style, the parent one, we had a background color of light gray, but I'll remove that and instead replace it with background color of white, border radius of 10 pixels, and overflow of hidden, just to match what we had down here for the listing content. So just add this in. Let's continue adding some elements to this listing, like the price and the address. I'll first make a wrapper div and give this a class name of listing details. Inside here, we'll have multiple rows. So I'll give it a class name of listing row. For now, we'll have two of these, one for the price and one for the address. And I'll start with the price. I'll make a span, give it a class name of listing price. And inside here, we can actually have the variable price that we destructured above. Next, we can put the address. Again, I'll make a span for this. Class name of listing address, and then just put in the variable address. Now let's apply some styles to the elements we just added. Let's start with the listing details. Giving it a height of, let's say, 35%. Just a reminder that the image container takes up a height of 65%, so we'll just give the remaining height to the listing details of 35%. We'll want it to be a flex box, so we'll give it a display of flex. For flex direction, we'll give it a column so that the items within this flex box will be positioned vertically. Justify content, we can say space evenly. And for align items, we'll say flex start. Then I'll just add some padding, 0 pixels on the top and bottom, and then 25 pixels on the left and the right, and a position of relative. Let's continue with the listing row. So we'll apply a margin of 6 pixels vertically to each one and 0 pixels horizontally. We'll also want a flex box within this row itself, where we apply align items of center. Now for the listing price, I'm just going to change the font size and make it a bit bigger. Font size, let's say 1.5 rem. And for the listing address, I'll apply a color of 737373. If we examine the output, we'll see that each card has a price and the address underneath. Also notice that the price has a slightly bigger font and the address is a bit gray. The next thing I'll add to this listing component is a tag that says for sale. So I'll just make a div and inside write for sale. And we can give this a class name of listing type. Let's apply styles to this. So first off, we'll give it a position of absolute and a font size of 0.8 rem. We'll position it on the right side, so what we can do is do right 10 pixels and top 10 pixels. Next, we'll give it a background color. I'll give it a light blue color. You can copy paste this value of 223, 247, 255. Padding, we'll give it 5 pixels on the top and bottom and 10 pixels on the left and the right. And finally a border radius of, let's say, 15 pixels. Again, if we observe the output, we have 3 cards, and now each one has a for sale tag. Next up, we'll be using the React Icons library that we installed earlier. This makes it really easy to use icons inside the application. In our case, we'll be using the Font Awesome icons, which have a lot of different options. I'll be making a new component and titling it feature. So go ahead and make the feature.js file as well as the feature.css file. Again, we'll be using a React functional component. I'll first start off by importing some of the things we'll use. So I'll be importing everything from Font Awesome, and I'll import the CSS as well. For props, what we'll take in is the icon name and the icon label. So the icon name is the actual name coming from this library. So this will allow us to dynamically render different icons. And the label is just a text that we'll display right next to that icon. So for the class name, I'll title this feature. And inside we'll want to render an icon. So what we can do is create a component called icon. And this will be passed in Font Awesome with the icon name that we passed in as a prop. Then we can actually have this icon being rendered inside this div. And we'll give it a class name of feature icon. We'll also wrap this inside a circle. So just to give it an outline. And I'll give this a class name of feature circle. And right next to that circle, we'll just have a text. So I'll put a span, class name of feature label, and in here we'll have the variable icon label. Inside the feature.css file, we'll add some styles. We'll start off with the feature, giving it a display of flex. We'll align items in the center, and we'll give it a margin right of 20 pixels. Next, we'll do the feature circle. We'll give this a width of 30 pixels, height of 30 pixels, border radius of 50% so that it's a circle. We'll give it a background color. For the hex value, we'll use F1, 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 like a light gray. We'll also make this a display of flex so we can center the items in the middle. So for justify content, center. And the same thing for aligning the items, center. And a margin right of 4 pixels. Next up, for the icon itself, we'll give it a darker gray color. So for the hex value, we'll use 737373. And lastly, the feature label, so that text that we'll be displaying, we'll just give it a white space of no wrap so that it stays on one line and it doesn't wrap to a new line. Now in our listing.js file, let's actually add these features. So I'll make a div inside here, giving it again a class name of listing row. So now we basically have 3 rows, one for the price up here, one for the address, and now one for these icons. And inside here, we'll add the feature that we just created. So for the first one, we'll give it an icon name of FA bed, and an icon label equal to the num bedroom variable. So just as a note, this FA bed icon name comes from the React Icons library. If you want, you can see the full list of icon names from this website. So we'll copy paste this 2 more times. For the second one, instead of bed, we'll have FA shower, and the icon label will be number of washrooms. And for the last one, we'll have FA ruler, and the icon label will be living space variable. Remember, we have these variables up here that we destructured from the data property. Just a minor typo to note is that instead of num washroom, they should be num washrooms, and we'll make that fix over here, just because in the data.js file we were calling it num washrooms, so that was just a little typo we need to fix. So as we can see, we built a beautiful card component now that has icons with some text next to it. We're all done with this part. Now we can continue with the expanded view of this card. The first thing I'll do to build the expanded view is create an overlay component. And this component will simply take up the entire width and height of the screen with a transparent background color. So let's create our overlay.js and overlay.css. We'll import the CSS file. So for the props, we'll first take a special children prop. And what we can do with this is inside this div, pass in that variable. And then this will allow us to do something like this, where we have overlay, the overlay component, and then inside we have children, whatever it may be, like a div, a span, doesn't really matter. But basically it's a special prop that allows us to add children nested inside this component. Then for the parent div, we'll give it a class name of overlay. The second prop we'll pass in, we'll call it close, and this will just be a function handler that when we click on top of this div, it'll close the overlay. So we can pass in an onClick, and this will be passed in the close function handler. Now let's style this overlay. First and foremost, I'll give it a position of fixed, because as we said, we just want it to take up the entire width and height. So for top, I'll give it 0. Left, I'll give this 0. Width of 100% and height of 100%. For background, we'll just give it an RGBA of 0, 0, 0, so black, and a transparency of 0.6. Then I'll give this a Z index of 100, so that it's positioned on top of the other cards, and a display of flex. Now we'll also add some media queries to make the overlay responsive. So I'll add one for small UI and one for bigger screens. So let's first start with the smaller screens. So for the overlay, we'll make the overflow scroll. We'll justify content in the center, align items in the flex start, and we'll give it a padding of 40 pixels on the top and 0 pixels horizontally. On bigger screens, we have more space, so for the overlay, we can give it a justify content center and align items of center. Now the key to the responsiveness here is really just the overflow Y scroll that we'll just need on smaller screens because there's less space. So I want the user to be able to scroll vertically. So that's it for the styling. What we'll need now is logic to render this overlay. Remember earlier inside the card.js file, we had this comment, logic for rendering the expanded view. So we'll need to add this here. To do that, we'll need state. So I'll import useState from React. Now I'll make a piece of state to keep track of whether or not we should render the overlay. I'll call it open, and we can initialize it to false. Next, I'll create some helper methods to open or close this overlay. So I'll call it open modal. And all this will do is basically set open to true. I'll do the same thing for the close modal. In this case, it will be set open to false. So now that we've created a piece of state to keep track of whether we should render the overlay or not, and we've also added helper methods to open and close, the first thing we can do is in the listing add a new prop called open. And we'll pass in the open modal method we just created. Inside the listing.js file itself, we'll need to make sure to add this new prop. And in the outermost div, we can add this onClick equal to open. Let's navigate back to our card.js file. I'll remove this comment, and now we can add some JavaScript. So we'll say open, and if it's open, we want to render an overlay. We'll pass in the close modal function. And we'll need to make sure to import the overlay. And lastly, I'll have a comment in here. So modal should go in here, because remember in the overlay, one of the props was children. So we can add some divs or spans or any elements inside this overlay. So later on what we'll have is the modal, basically the expanded listing will go inside here. If we examine the output and we click on one of these cards, we'll see that the overlay is rendered and it has a transparent background. When we click on this overlay, it goes away. Again, if we click on it, the overlay is rendered, and when we click on this, it closes. So this is the logic that we expected. Before we go any further, I'll just organize things a bit more by putting all of these files inside a card folder. So I'll just move all of these inside the folder. And it's also important to note that this won't change anything because we already have this index.js file where we export the card. So it'll still work like this. Now let's go ahead and build the expanded view. I'll create a component for this called modal. We can make the modal.js as well as the modal.css. And as a prop, we'll pass in the data as well as a button to close the modal. I'll also import a few things. First, I'll import the CSS file. Then I'll import the feature component that we had created earlier. And lastly, I'll import a close icon. And this will be imported from React icons. So you can put these same inputs that I have, and now we can continue with the elements. For the outermost component of the modal, we can give it a class name of modal. And then inside here, the first element we can start with is the image. So we can give this a class name of modal image. We can give it an alt of real estate mansion. And now we need to apply the source. So remember, this source is going to come from the data prop we have up here. So we can use the destructuring property again in JavaScript. So I want things like the image URL, the address, price, and all that. And remember, we have everything inside our listing.js. So we can copy paste this directly and apply it inside the modal.js. And for the source, we'll just pass in the image URL. One thing to note is that since this is the expanded view, we'll also add the description. So if you recall, in our data.js, we also had this long description, and this is what we'll render as well with the other information inside the expanded view. So just make sure to add that in here. The next element we'll render will be a container to hold all the information like the price, address, and all that. So we can have a class name of modal info. Within this div, we can have multiple rows of information. So we'll give it a class name of modal row. And we can copy paste this 2 more times. So the first one will have a row for the price, one for the address, and then one for the icons. Remember, this is similar to what we did in the listing.js. So here we had a row for the price, a row for the address, and then a row for the icons. So it's basically the same thing, except later on we'll be adding some more information like the description and all that. But for now, we can continue with this. So inside this row, the first thing I'll do is have a span for the price. This one will give it a class name of modal price and render price variable inside here. The next one we'll do is the address. So again, just render a span, give it a class name of modal address, and inside here we can have the address variable. And lastly, we'll have the icons inside here. So we'll put those 3 icons inside the feature component we made. The first one will have the icon name will be FA bed, and the icon label will give it num bedroom. And again, this will be the same thing that we had in the listing. So we'll have the number of washrooms and living space as well. I'll just copy paste that here. And we can just place that here. Let's continue by adding some styles. So I'll structure this by having first some general styles and then media queries so that we can have different styles depending on the screen size and make it responsive. So first I'll start off with the modal class, and I'll give this a minimum height of, let's say, 600 pixels. I'll also apply a border radius of 20 pixels. I'll give it a position of relative. For background color, I'll give it white. And I'll also give it a box shadow. Again, I'm just going to copy paste a value that I used and I think is nice, and you can grab this from my repository. And we want it to be a flex box, so display of flex. Now we can add some media queries. So I'll start off for small screens. At media only screen. And then in here, we'll have our modal class. On small screens, we'll give it a width of 90%. We'll give it a height of auto. A flex direction of column. Justify content of space between. We'll align items in the center and give it a padding of 15 pixels. And doing it this way will position the items vertically, which is better for smaller screens. Next, we'll have a breakpoint for a bigger screen, things like a desktop. We'll set the min width to 1281 pixels. I'll fix this typo here. So basically on sizes bigger than a width of 1281 pixels, we'll trigger this breakpoint. So in this case, we'll have a width of 80%, a height of 80%. For max width, we'll set it to, let's say, 1800 pixels. We'll want to justify content, this time space between. Align items in the center. And flex direction, this time will be row. Padding will be 30 pixels. So just a recap, on smaller screens we'll have a flex direction of column, but on bigger screens where we have more width, we'll give it a flex of row. This should be actually flex direction. Let's navigate back to the card.js component and render the modal. This way we can track our progress. So in here, let's render the modal component and don't forget to import it. Then we can forward the data prop. Now let's do a test when we click on one of these cards and see what happens. So as we expected, we have the overlay in the background, and in the middle we have this modal component with an image and some information on the side like the price, the address, and the icons. Obviously we want it to look a bit nicer, so we'll apply some more styling. Let's continue adding styles to the modal.css. So for the modal row, I'll give it a margin, 20 pixels on the top and bottom and 0 pixels on the left and right. Then I'll give it a display of flex. We'll align items in the center and give it a text align of left. Next, for the modal price, I'll adjust the font size. We'll make it bigger and give it a font size of 3 rem. Then for the modal address, I'll give this one a font size of 1.5 rem. We'll also apply a color. We can give it a hex value of 737373. So if we examine the output, we'll see that the information on the right side appears much cleaner than how it looked like before. But we'll still need to style the image because it takes too much space. So for the modal image, in this class we'll give it an object fit of cover and a border radius of 20 pixels. So this is what we have for the general styles, and now on small screens we'll give it a width of 100%. And on larger screens, since it's being positioned next to the details, we'll give it a smaller width. In particular, we'll give it a width of a calculation. We'll do 70% minus 10 pixels. And we'll also apply a height of 100%. Again, if we examine the progress, we'll see that now the image occupies less space, and we can see that it's also responsive. So on smaller screen sizes, it should be positioned vertically. So there we go, as we expect, the items are positioned vertically on smaller screen sizes. We still have some more styling to do, so we can see that the container of this one doesn't occupy that much width, so we'll adjust this now. So now we can add some style to the modal info class. And remember, this is just the container that has all the information like the price, address. It's just a container for all those elements. So I'll add some styles to that. Modal info. The general style will be to have a background color of white, and we can have a display of flex. Now on small screen sizes, again we'll have a different style. What we'll have on small screen sizes is a width of, let's say, 100%. We can have a height of 100%, padding of 20 pixels, and we can have a flex direction of column, as well as align items flex start. Now we can do the styles on bigger screens. So in this breakpoint, add the modal info class. And on bigger screens, we'll have a bit different width. So in this case, we'll have a width of, let's say, 30% minus 10 pixels. Height, we'll have 100% in this case. Padding of 20 pixels. Flex direction of column, and align items, we can say flex start. Let's track our progress again. So if we click on one of these, we see that the information on the right side is much more organized than how it was before. The positioning is much better. Let's also check on a smaller screen size. So there you go, you can see it's much cleaner than how it was earlier. The next element we can add is the description. So I'll first make a container for this and give it a class name of modal description wrapper. And inside this div, we'll have a paragraph and give it a class name of modal description. Remember up here we had this description variable, so we can put that inside this paragraph. Now let's style these. So we can start off with the wrapper. I'll give it a margin of 20 pixels vertically, 0 pixels horizontally. Next, a text align of left. And overflow Y of scroll. So this way, if there's too much information, we'll be able to scroll it. And display, we'll give this flex. Align items, flex start. And justify content, flex start. For the description itself, the paragraph, we can have a color of light gray, so let's say a hex value of 737373. Margin, we'll set this to 0 pixels. A padding as well of 0 pixels. And we can have a font size of 1.25 rem. So now if we expand one of these views, we'll see that the description appears. Same thing on smaller screen sizes. We'll see that it appears right under these icons. So it's also responsive. I'll just change this scroll bar over here because I think the basic one doesn't look that nice. So we'll add our own custom scroll bar. In the app.css, let's add a style for the WebKit scroll bar. In particular, we'll make the width 5 pixels, and we'll set the background color to transparent. Next, we'll style the thumb, so WebKit scroll bar thumb. We'll also give it a background color, In this case, we'll have a grayish color, so CA, CA, CA as the hex value, and we'll apply a border radius of 5 pixels. So now we can see this custom scroll bar on the description, and it's much nicer than the default one. So we're almost done with the expanded view. We just have a few more finishing touches. One thing we'll notice is that every time we open an expanded view, anywhere we click on this view, it'll close. But this isn't really expected behavior. What we actually want is to have a close icon in the top right that we can close this way, or if we click outside this area, like over here, it'll close. But if we click inside this modal, we don't want it to close. So let's implement that change. I'll add an onClick to the modal component for the outermost div. And we'll call the stop propagation method. What this will do is prevent from calling the parent onClick. In our case, the parent of this modal is the overlay, and the onClick that we pass in is a close method, which closes the expanded view. So now that we added this change, stop propagation, if we examine the output and we open one of these, we'll notice that when we click inside, it doesn't close the modal anymore, which is what we want. But when we click outside of this view on the overlay, it closes it. So this is better behavior. Now let's add the X icon in the top right corner. In the modal component, let's add a button. We'll give it a class name of modal close wrapper. This will just be the container for the icon that we'll put in. So inside here, we'll use the IO close circle outline that we imported earlier from React icons. And for the button, we'll also pass in an onClick, which would be the close method coming from the prop. And lastly, for the IO close circle outline, we'll give it a class name of modal close icon. An important thing to mention is that in our card.js, right now we only pass in the data as a prop, but we should also pass in the close method. So remember, this is the close modal function. So again, just to recap, is that the modal component takes a data prop and it also takes a close prop. So we didn't pass this in yet, and we just did that now by passing in the close modal function. So now we have a button with a class name and an onClick, and we can add styles to the button and the outline. We'll start with the general styles and then move on to the different styling on a smaller screen and bigger screen. So first, for the modal close wrapper, I'll specify a property of all unset just to remove the default CSS, then give it a position of absolute, and lastly a cursor of pointer. Next, for the icon, I will give this a width of 40 pixels as well as a height of 40 pixels. So these are the general styles. Now let's move on to on small screens. So for small screens, we'll have the modal close wrapper, but in this case, we'll position it right, -20 pixels, and top -30 pixels. So it'll be positioned outside of the modal on the top right. Next, we'll have the icon. We'll make it a bit smaller for smaller screens, so we'll say width 35 pixels and height 35 pixels. And we'll give it a different color of hex CA, CA, CA. And lastly, on bigger screens, navigate down here. So on bigger screens, we'll position this inside the modal. So right of 10 pixels and top of 10 pixels. And for the icon, we will give this a color of hex 737373. If we click on one of these cards, we'll see that the X icon appears in the top right. And when we click on the X icon, it appropriately closes it to the minimized view. Again, we can notice that if we click on anywhere inside the modal, like on the image, on the price, anywhere else, it won't close. It'll only close when we click this X icon or on the overlay outside. We'll also notice that it's responsive. So here the X icon appears outside of the modal, and when we have a bigger screen, it appears inside the modal. And the style looks pretty nice. So up to now, we've built a modern card that has the functionality to be expanded when we click on it. We'll add some finishing touches with some animations. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, we'll be using the Framer Motion library. This library makes it really easy to build complex animations. One of the most important things to know about this library is the motion component. This is basically the building block of the library. We'll be going through every step together, but if you want to know more and have a deeper dive into the documentation, you can check out the API documentation that I'll link in the description. So let's continue. I'll start off with a really easy example in the listing. So let's first import that motion component that I talked about. Import motion from Framer Motion. Now, let's replace the outermost div with a motion.div instead, and this will allow us to use some animation props. So now that we replace it with a motion.div, I'll pass in a while hover prop. And inside here, I'll pass in an object with a scale of 1.1. So let's see what this does. If we try to hover on top of one of these cards, we'll see that it scales as expected. And this was very simple to accomplish with the library. It only took us one line. The next concept that we'll be using in the Framer Motion library is variants. This ties nicely to what we're doing because we have two variants, one for being opened and one for being closed. We'll do this by applying a variance prop. Now, one thing to mention that's important is that changes in a variant propagate throughout the DOM. So as it's explained here, if a motion component has children, changes in variant will flow down through the component hierarchy. These changes in variant will flow down until a child component defines its own animate property. So what that basically means is that if we have this parent component with a variant, it's very easy for the nested children inside here to know whether it's opened or whether it's closed, which variant it is. So that makes building complex animations really simple. Let's start implementing these variants in the overlay.js. So first, import motion from Framer Motion. And now replace this div with a motion.div. Same thing for the closing tag. Now let's make our variants. So I'll call this variants, and it'll just be a JavaScript object. Inside here we'll have our nested variants, so open and closed. So we want different styles depending on whether it's opened or whether it's closed. For open, I'll set a background color of RGBA 0, 0, 0, and 0.6, so it has some opacity. And we'll apply the same thing to closed, except we'll change the opacity to 0 when it's closed. Now we can apply this for motion.div. So it's as simple as passing in the variance prop. And we'll just add a few more things. So for the initial variant, we'll set this to closed. We'll also set exit to closed, so whenever it's removed from the DOM, the variant is changed to closed. And lastly, we'll pass in the animate prop to open. So when it's rendered, it'll change from closed to open, and this animation should appear. So now let's continue with our modal.js component. And remember, this one is a child of this overlay, as we had it in the card. So the overlay is the parent of the modal. And as we spoke about earlier, because of the variance feature in Framer Motion, the modal component, the child, will know if the parent, which variant state it's in. So if it's opened or if it's closed. So now let's go back here and let's import motion from Framer Motion. And the first thing we'll start with is the outermost div. So change this to a motion.div. And now we can define our variant. So I'll call this modal variance. And we'll have an opened. And we'll also have a closed like we did before. So when it's opened, we'll have an opacity of 1. And we'll also have a special field, transition. And here we'll pass in staggered children of 0.5 and delayed children of 0.2. So let's talk about what we're doing here exactly. So when it's open, it'll have an opacity of 1. And when Framer Motion will see this transition with a staggered children and delayed children, it'll apply some special effects. So basically, instead of animating all the children of this component at the same time, it'll animate them with a delay in between them, in this case of 0.5 seconds. So now for the close, just put an opacity of 0. Now that we created the variant, we can pass it in as a prop. So variance equal to modal variance. So remember, this outermost component has 2 children, one for the image and then one for the info. So now we can continue with the image. I'll replace this with motion.image. And again, we'll do image variance. With opened and closed. So we'll start with open. We can set the opacity to 1. And we'll also set a value for y, so the vertical positioning. When it's opened, we'll set it to 0% of the viewport height. And when it's closed, we'll have opacity of 0, and y will be -10 of the viewport height. So what this will do is when we go from closed to open, it'll start a bit higher, and I'll have this effect where it's coming downwards. So now we can apply this image variant as a prop. And now we can continue on to the modal info, and then after that we'll do the modal row. So we can change all these divs with a motion.div. We can do that in VS Code by doing change all occurrences and write motion.div. So up here I'll define a modal info variance. So again, when it's open, we'll have opacity of 1. And in this case, we'll also have a transition and staggered children of 0.2. When it's closed, we just set opacity to 0. Let's apply that here. And lastly, let's do this modal row. So I'll say const modal row variance. When it's open, it'll have opacity of 1. And in this case, we'll navigate on the x-axis. So x will be 0 when it's opened. And when it's closed, we'll have opacity of 0 again. In this case, we'll have an x value of 10%. So again, this is going to be like when we're closed, it'll be a bit to the right, and then when we're open, it'll be at 0, so it'll have this effect that it's coming in from the left, or coming in towards the left. And here, actually, I noticed there's a little typo here. It says motion.motion.div, but replace this with motion.div, and same thing for the closing tag. So just make sure to clean up your tags here. And now we can apply this variant to all the places that we have a modal row. So here, variance equal to modal row variance. I'll copy paste that here, here, and here. I'll also apply that variant to the description wrapper, just so it also has that same effect of coming in to the left. So if we click on one of these cards, let's see what happens. This looks great. So as we expected, the image slides down from the top, and each text item on the right renders one after the other with a sliding effect. Also notice how the overlay fades in. This is much more fluid and dynamic than how it was before without animations. I'll just have some finishing touches. So when we click on this X icon or hover on top of it, I want it to have an expanding effect. And we'll also notice that when we close this component, there's no animation, it just disappears. So there's an animation when it's opened, but then when we close it, it just disappears right away. And one of the reasons for this is we need to use animate presence from Framer Motion. And this helps us to animate components when they're removed from the React tree, basically when they're not rendered anymore. So in our card component, let's import animate presence from Framer Motion. And now let's scroll down to where we had our overlay, and we're going to wrap this inside an animate presence. So place that inside here. And lastly, we'll need to give the overlay component, we'll need to give it a unique key. So I'll just put this as overlay. So now when we close one of these cards, there should be an animation. So as expected, instead of just disappearing, there's an animation when it leaves the DOM. So this is more responsive than how it was before. And lastly, I'll just have that finishing touch to have a hover effect on this X button. Navigate to the modal component and change the button with a motion.button. Same thing for the closing tag. And now pass in a while hover prop. And we'll give it scale of 1.2. The very last fix that I'll do is navigate to the app.js file, and we'll give each card a unique ID, just so that React doesn't print that error message. So pass in key equal to item.id. Let's do a recap on what we built. So we built an expanding card using the React and Framer Motion library. These animations are quite complex and look really nice. Also a reminder that we made the components responsive. So we'll see on smaller screen sizes, it looks nice as well. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate the support, and if you can, I'd appreciate a like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.